I want to start with a note, not a discovery, not a press release, not a headline, a note. Buried in the appendix of a 1968 oceanographic survey conducted by the Lamont Doherty Geological Observatory, one of the most respected marine research institutions in the world at the time. The note reads, in full, anomalous linear return observed at grid reference 14 north 61 west. Pattern inconsistent with known geological formation types. Not pursued further. That's it. 4 sentences. The survey moves on. The note is never referenced again in any subsequent publication from that institution. I found it while cross-referencing acoustic survey data from a separate Caribbean basin study, and when I first read it, I thought nothing of it. Linear return, geological anomaly, these things happen. Ocean floors are complicated. Then I found the second one. Different institution, different year, different ocean. A 1971 Soviet oceanographic report, partially declassified in the 1990s and translated in a specialist journal whose citation alone invites a particular kind of dismissal. The translated passage notes, and I want to be precise about the language here, regular geometric interval observed in bottom return data at depth 2,800 meters. Formation inconsistent with volcanic or sedimentary origin. Hypothesis instrument error, not investigated instrument error, filed, moved on. I am a skeptic. I want to be clear about that before I say anything else. I spent years doing technical writing for an environmental consultancy, and I understand the instinct to attribute anomalous data to instrument error. It is usually correct. Usually. The ocean floor is the least mapped surface on the planet. We have higher resolution topographic data for the surface of Mars than we do for 80% of the Earth's ocean floor. Instrument error is a reasonable default, but here is what I could not explain away. What I spent 3 years trying to explain away and failed. Not one note, not 2, 23 separate documented instances across 4 decades, across 6 different national oceanographic programs, across 3 separate ocean basins, all using identical language to describe what they could not explain, all using the words linear, geometric, regular interval, all reaching the same conclusion, instrument error, not investigated, 23 times, the same explanation, never investigated. This is where the story begins. And once you understand what those notes are pointing at, what they collectively describe, what they have in common with patterns we've documented on land, you will not look at a map of the ocean the same way again. Never. Let's begin with what we know about the ocean floor. The deep abyssal plains that cover roughly 50% of the Earth's total surface are largely basalt, ancient, dense, geologically stable. They do not produce regular geometric formations. The processes that shape them, seafloor spreading, volcanic eruption, sedimentation, are chaotic at the human scale. Symmetric in the broad sense of tectonic movement, yes, but locally, at the scale of hundreds of meters, the ocean floor should be irregular, random, shaped by forces indifferent to geometry. What sonar surveys return when they hit a regular geometric pattern is called a structured acoustic return. The signal bounces off angular surfaces, off edges at regular intervals in a way that rock simply does not produce. Engineers who design sonar systems spend considerable effort filtering these returns out when they appear, because they typically indicate equipment malfunction, a failing transducer, a software glitch, an artifact of signal processing, except. In 2001, a research team from the Cuban government working with a Canadian company called Advanced Digital Communications was conducting a sonar survey of a deep water channel off Cuba's western coast, the Yucatan Channel between the peninsula and the island. They were looking for shipwrecks. They found something else. At a depth of between 600 and 750 meters, their side-scan sonar returned what lead researcher Paulina Zalitsky described in her published report as symmetrically organized stone structures resembling an urban complex, pyramidal forms, perpendicular alignments, regular spacing, on the ocean floor in the Caribbean at depth. The discovery was covered. It made international headlines. The BBC reported it. Nature magazine noted it. And then, within approximately 18 months, something happened that I've come to recognise as a pattern. The coverage stopped. The follow-up expeditions that Zalitsky's team proposed and partially funded produced results that were never fully published. The geological assessments, the independent verification, the peer-reviewed analysis, none of it appeared. The story entered a middle state, not disproven, not confirmed, simply suspended, floating without resolution in the space where scientific questions go to be forgotten. I spoke with a retired ocean geologist loosely affiliated with a tangential survey project in the region. He asked not to be named, which I respect and which I think tells you something. He said, and I'm quoting from notes I took during our conversation, "The data from Cuba was real. I've seen the original sonar returns. The question of what produced them is genuinely open. The question of why nobody went back is less open. Why did nobody go back? The Yucatan Channel discovery is the most public case. It is not the most significant. Because when you begin cross-referencing it against those archived notes, a pattern begins to assemble itself that I find impossible to attribute to coincidence." The 1968 note from Lamont Doherty, grid reference 14, North 61 West, that is northeast of Venezuela, Southern Caribbean Basin. The depth of that survey corresponds to approximately 800 meters in that region, within the same general depth band as the Cuba discovery, 3 degrees of latitude apart. The 1971 Soviet report. The translated location reference puts it in the northwestern Atlantic at approximately 30 degrees north, 45 degrees west, mid-Atlantic, a different basin, a different depth, but the same language, regular geometric interval, inconsistent with geological origin. I spent time mapping all 23 reports, not just those 2, all of them, plotting coordinates, cross-referencing depths, looking for the pattern or the absence of one. Here is what I found. The anomalous returns do not scatter randomly across the ocean floor. They cluster, 3 primary clusters, each in a different ocean basin. The Caribbean cluster, the most documented, with 8 separate reports across 4 decades. The Mid-Atlantic cluster, 5 reports, and what I'll call, for lack of a better term, the Southeast Pacific cluster, centered roughly around a zone southeast of the Polynesian island chain. 7 reports, several from Japanese oceanographic surveys conducted between 1985 and 1995. 3 clusters, 3 ocean basins, each spanning multiple decades and multiple survey programs, each producing the same acoustic signature, each producing the same conclusion, instrument error, not investigated. Now here is where I need you to pay attention, because this is the piece I did not expect to find, and once I found it, I could not stop thinking about it. The spacing between the anomaly clusters is not random. I want to be careful about how I say this. I am not a mathematician. I ran the analysis with a geographer I trust, and I want to represent her conclusions accurately. This is what she found. The 3 primary anomaly clusters, when mapped on a globe, are separated by distances that are, and these are her words, consistent with a regularly spaced network, if a 4th and possibly 5th cluster exist in locations we have either not yet surveyed adequately, or have surveyed but whose data has not been publicly released, consistent with a regularly spaced network. That is the language of someone being very careful. What she means, what the geometry suggests, is that these 3 clusters are not random points. They are positions in a pattern that implies additional positions we haven't found, or haven't been allowed to find, or haven't thought to look for because we've been told there's nothing there. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. I want to talk about Yonaguni. The Yonaguni Monument, a formation of flat-faced terraced rock off the coast of Yonaguni Island in Japan, discovered by a diver named Kihachiro Aratake in 1987, has been the subject of one of the longest-running and least resolved debates in contemporary archaeology. The structure, and I'll call it a structure because that is what it appears to be, consists of massive stone terraces, right angles, parallel walls, what appear to be roads or causeways, and a central feature that multiple researchers have described as resembling a ceremonial stairway, all underwater, all at a depth of 5 to 27 meters, all in a configuration that, if exposed above water, would attract no controversy whatsoever. If this were on land, we would call it an ancient site. The mainstream geological position is that Yonaguni is a natural formation, a product of the specific fracture patterns of local sandstone, which does tend to fracture along regular planes. This is a legitimate scientific position. I am not here to dismiss it. But here is what the mainstream geological position does not engage with. The tool marks. Multiple researchers, including geologists who examined the site in person and are not affiliated with any alternative history community, have noted what appear to be regular marks on specific faces of the formation. Marks that would indicate the stone was worked. Marks that the natural fracture hypothesis does not account for. The mainstream response to the tool marks is not a counter-argument. It is silence. The marks exist in the published record. They are not disputed. They are simply not addressed. And Yonaguni is shallow, 15 meters at its deepest visible extent, which means that when it was above water, and the regional sea level data suggests that would have been approximately 10 to 12,000 years ago at minimum, it would have been a structure built in conditions entirely consistent with human activity. Built, if it was built, by people who existed before the end of the last ice age, before the event that raised sea levels enough to submerge it, before everything we currently call civilization. The deeper question, the one the Yonaguni debate consistently sidesteps, is not whether this specific formation is natural or artificial. It is what sits in the deeper water nearby. The sonar surveys of the waters around Yonaguni, and these are documented and partially public, show anomalous returns at depths between 200 and 600 meters, depths that correspond to a much earlier sea level, depths that correspond in the Pacific Basin chronology to a period we have no settled name for, a period before the Great Submergence. Nobody has gone to look, not officially, not with the tools we now have available. The sonar anomalies in the Yonaguni deep water region appear in the survey literature as footnotes, noted, attributed to geological irregularity, not investigated. Let me take you somewhere else, the Bahama Banks, the shallow carbonate platform extending north and east of Cuba, one of the largest such platforms on Earth. In 1968, in the same year as that Lamont Doherty note, a pilot named Robert Brush spotted what appeared to be a road or wall formation in the clear, shallow water off North Bimini. Underwater, straight, composed of large flat stones laid in a regular pattern, it became known as the Bimini Road. The official scientific determination is that the Bimini Road is a natural beach rock formation. Beach rock fractures in regular patterns as it consolidates and can produce formations that appear rectilinear. This is true. Beach rock does do this, but the Bimini formation has features that routine beach rock fracturing does not produce. Multiple researchers have noted that individual stones in the formation appear to have been turned from their original orientation, as if moved and repositioned. Some stones show what appear to be tool marks along their edges. The stones are of a type, micrite limestone, that does not originate locally. They were transported. The official response to these specific observations follows the now familiar pattern. The observations are in the literature. They are not contested on the specific points. They are noted, and then the discussion moves on to other things. The Bahama Banks, when sea levels were lower during the last glacial maximum, were dry land. Dry, flat, extensive land. The kind of terrain where people build things. The kind of terrain that is now, depending on location, between 1 and 20 meters underwater. Whatever was built on those banks during the period of lower sea level is still there. The Bimini Road may be the most visible remnant of it. The question nobody is asking with adequate seriousness is what else is there? Not in the shallows where divers have already looked, but in the deeper water off the shelf edge where the instruments have occasionally returned something they chose to call error. There is a third location I want to examine because I think it completes something. the Mediterranean seafloor. Between the Sicilian Channel and the Maltese archipelago, at depths ranging from 150 to 400 meters, sonar surveys conducted as part of a joint Italian-Maltese geological assessment in 2009 documented what the technical report describes as linear sediment disturbance patterns inconsistent with current or tidal formation processes, suggesting possible anthropogenic origin of undetermined age. Possible anthropogenic origin, undetermined age. That phrase appears once in the report. It is not followed up in the conclusion section. It is not referenced in the abstract. It sits in the body of the technical findings like an item that was too specific to omit and too inconvenient to feature. The Mediterranean is a different case from the open ocean sites because the sea level history there is exceptionally well documented. We know exactly how much of the Mediterranean coastline was exposed land during the glacial maximum. We know the dates. The areas now submerged between Sicily and Malta, areas where that sonar anomaly sits, were above water until approximately 10,000 years ago. The Maltese island chain has megalithic temple complexes that predate the Egyptian pyramids and whose origins remain, in the academic literature, somewhat unclear. The island chain sits above the water. The sonar anomalies sit just below the water's edge, geographically adjacent. Nobody has asked whether they are related. I asked a researcher at the University of Malta who works on Maltese prehistory. She said she found the correlation interesting and that to her knowledge, no funded expedition had ever been organized to investigate it. When I asked why not, she said she didn't know, and that was the end of the conversation. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. I want to talk about a paper that couldn't be published. In 2013, a researcher I'll call DR, because he hasn't given me permission to use his name, and because the professional consequences if I did would be significant, submitted work to a mid-tier geoscience journal proposing what he called a preliminary framework for understanding deep ocean rectilinear sonar anomalies as potential indicators of pre-submergence anthropogenic activity. The paper was not rejected outright. It was returned with a request for revisions. DR describes those revisions in an email he sent me, and I'm quoting directly. Not revisions in the scientific sense, revisions in the framing sense. The reviewers wanted the anthropogenic hypothesis removed entirely and the paper reframed as a discussion of natural geological processes. They weren't asking me to change the data. They were asking me to change what the data was allowed to mean. He declined. The paper was rejected. He submitted it elsewhere. Rejected again. He eventually published a shortened version in a conference proceedings document that has the bibliographic footprint of something carefully placed where it is hard to find. I located it in the bibliography of a footnote in a tangentially related paper, which is where things go when the goal is not destruction but displacement, not banned, not disproven, displaced. DR's displaced paper made a claim I have spent considerable time trying to verify or falsify. His claim was this: the anomaly clusters he identified in deep ocean sonar data, taken together with known terrestrial anomaly zones, describe a pattern of roughly equal spacing consistent with a global network designed to specific geodetic parameters. Parameters that correspond to divisions of the Earth's circumference that would require a level of planetary scale surveying capability that no civilization in the official historical record possessed. Planetary scale surveying. The phrase sat with me, because here's what planetary scale surveying requires. You need precise measurement capability across vast distances, and you need a reference frame, a fixed set of points, each defined relative to the others that collectively lock in a coordinate system of sufficient precision to operate at global scale. The Amazon earthworks, the acoustic anomaly clusters, the equipment failure grid, the geoglyphs aligned to specific astronomical declinations, the food forests arranged in patterns that don't match natural succession. And now, sitting underneath all of it, literally, the ocean floor returns. What if these are not separate mysteries? What if they are features of the same reference frame? What if the question is not who built them, but what problem they were built to solve? And what if that problem was the oldest and most fundamental problem any civilization attempting to operate at planetary scale would face first? Where exactly are we relative to everything else? I want to return to Zalitsky, because I mentioned the Cuba data and I want to close that loop before we go further. After the initial coverage in 2001 and 2002, Zalitsky's team made 2 additional dives to the site using remotely operated vehicles. The footage from those dives has never been publicly released. The Cuban government holds it. Advanced Digital Communications, the company that funded the survey, has not published the results. Zalitsky herself gave a small number of interviews in the mid-2000s, described the footage as stunning and unlike anything she expected, and then went quiet. Not hostile to questions from what I can determine, simply quiet. In 2012, a journalist filed a Freedom of Information request with the Canadian government regarding any reports or communications related to the Cuban discovery that might have passed through federal scientific channels. The request was partially fulfilled. Certain documents were withheld on grounds of commercial confidentiality. The documents that were released contained no substantive information about the discovery itself. They contained procedural correspondence, meeting notes, scheduling emails, the bureaucracy of silence. Not a black bar across a paragraph, a stack of scheduling emails. I've spent time in this world long enough to recognize the mechanism. It's not that the anomalous observations were challenged and dismissed. Dismissal leaves a trace. Dismissal generates debate, counter-argument, the paper trail of scientific disagreement. What happens to the ocean floor anomalies is different. They are recorded and then they are simply not followed up on, not engaged with, not incorporated into the broader framework of understanding. Not disproven, absorbed. A paper written by a discredited crank invites scrutiny. A sonar note filed without comment in an appendix invites nothing. This raises a question I find more unsettling than any individual anomaly. Who benefits from not asking? I want to tell you what I think is at the bottom of this, and then I want to be honest about the limits of what I know. We do not have an adequate framework for discussing what the end of the last glacial maximum meant for human civilization. We know, this is not speculation, this is established glaciological science, that sea levels rose approximately 125 meters over a period of roughly 10,000 years at the close of the last ice age. We know that this process was not uniform, that there were periods of rapid rise, events within the broader trend where sea levels may have jumped by meters in decades rather than centuries. We know that the coastlines and lowland river valleys that were submerged during this period are the same kinds of terrain where every civilization we can name, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, the Yellow River, subsequently developed, which means that whatever existed in those coastal and lowland zones before the submergence is now underwater. Not hypothetically, not speculatively, with mathematical certainty. The terrain was there, the conditions for human habitation were there. The record of what happened in those zones is now under between 100 and 200 meters of ocean water, depending on location. We are not looking. Not in the systematic, adequately funded, institutionally backed way that the question deserves. The sonar anomalies cluster, the returns are documented, the coordinates are in archived field reports, and year after year, expedition after expedition, the notation is the same. Not investigated. The ocean floor is a historical record, not metaphorically, literally. Whatever civilizational activity occurred in those pre-submergence coastal zones left physical traces on the ground surface. The ground surface is now the seafloor. The traces are still there. Some of them, perhaps many of them, are in the exact coordinates where survey after survey has documented acoustic anomalies and then declined to investigate them. I've been sitting with this story for 3 years. 3 years of archived technical reports and conversation with researchers who speak carefully, who ask for their names not to be used, who publish in conference proceedings instead of journals because the journals ask them to change what the data was allowed to mean. And I keep arriving at the same place. The ocean is not a barrier. For most of human history, the coastal margins and shallow seas were the zones of densest human activity. The ocean connected rather than divided. And when the great submergence came, when sea levels rose and the coastlines retreated inland, and the places people had built were covered in water, the record of those places went with them. Not destroyed. Covered. The record is still there. The sonar anomalies in the Caribbean basin, the structured returns in the mid-Atlantic, the clusters in the southeast Pacific, the linear formations off Malta, the tool-marked terraces at Yonaguni, the formation off Bimini with its transported limestone and its turned stones. These are not isolated curiosities, they are pieces of an archive. An archive we have developed the instruments to begin reading, and then, consistently, persistently, with a regularity that itself demands explanation, chosen not to. Whatever is encoded in those anomalies, whatever the grid represents, whatever the regular spacing implies about the knowledge system that produced it, it has been waiting. It waited through the submergence. It waited through the entire history of the civilizations we do officially acknowledge. It waited through 2 centuries of oceanographic survey programs that developed the tools to find it, and then looked away. It is patient in the way that submerged stone is patient, in the way that a coordinate persists, in the way that a grid continues to be a grid regardless of whether anyone reads it. The deepest ocean, the least examined surface on Earth, the burial ground for every coastal civilization that stood before the waters rose. Whatever they built is still there. We just haven't decided to look. And the strangest part, the part I keep returning to, is that we keep almost looking. 23 times across 4 decades, instruments found it. 23 times researchers noted it. 23 times the conclusion was the same. Not investigated, not disproven, not explained, not resolved, just not investigated. The ocean floor has a street grid, or something that functions like one, or something that produces the acoustic signature of one. And somewhere between the sonar return and the field report, between the anomalous data and the archived appendix, between the observation and the silence, something is being decided, something is being chosen. And whatever it is, whatever that choice protects or prevents or preserves, it has been made 23 times in 4 decades by people in different countries, different institutions, different decades, working independently, reaching identical conclusions, not investigated. The water is very deep, the grid is very old, and nobody in any official capacity with any institutional backing has yet decided to go and look.